Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got more of the GMade GOM build. Last time we more or less finished what you might call the chassis, so this week it's the cage and the body panels. Hopefully we'll have it finished by the end of the video. Step 75 and 76 are similar to most kits, where we're going to prepare the plastic bits for some paint. First we're going to need to cut the parts from the vac form bits you get in the kit. I usually start with a rough cut, staying well outside the cut lines to make the parts more manageable. Then tidy them up with a combination of small scissors, knives and some very light sandpaper. All the clear parts have dimples or punch marks that need drilling out. There's a mix of 2.5, 3 and 5mm holes. If you're very careful you can use a body reamer, just watch out for making the holes too big. When all the parts are cut and drilled, everything needs to be thoroughly washed in some lukewarm soapy water. Rinse to get all the soap off and then left to dry out. All the parts have an overspray film on the outside. It's easy to find on the shape parts, but the flat panels can be a bit tricky. To make sure we paint on the right side, I've marked the side with the film so we can't get it wrong. To make them easier to paint, they're all going to get stuck down with a blob of blue tack to some cardboard. The only thing to watch out for is the blue tack can get a bit oily, so watch where your fingers go. We don't want to get our nice clean surfaces we're about to paint greasy. For paint we've got some Core RC metallic blue and jet black. I've not used Core RC paints before, but I have heard good things. I won't do a full paint tutorial here as there's plenty of dedicated videos around, but as long as you keep the coats fairly light and build it all up nice and slowly, you can't really go wrong. Here's the interior painted, but there's one more thing I want to do before it's ready for step 77. The top of the dash is going to be super glossy when we peel the overspray film off. So I'm going to partially peel it back and for a bit of a contrast mask off the top of the binnacle, then give it a spray on the outside with the black paint. When we peel the mask off, it kind of looks like the instrument binnacle and the rest of the dash could be two separate parts. Perfect! There's also this other bit of masking tape at one end of the dash, but we'll get to what that's for when we start to stick the decals on. The steering wheel and gear stick could just go straight on, but with a bit of paint they'll look a lot better. So we need to cut them free from the parts trees and stick them to some card with some more blue tack. First they'll get a coat of plastic primer so the paint actually sticks, and then some matte black. Now you might think that's a bit daft as they're going to look pretty much the same as they did before the paint. But now we've got a base that won't flake off, and best of all, Tamiya paints will lay down nice and evenly. You'll have to wait a minute or two until we're ready to fit them to see the results. Right, that's all the bits ready to put together, so we'll move on to step 77, the dashboard. All the screws and bits we need are in the G-bag. The wheels are in here too. I think they're the last things to go together, so that bodes well for having the truck running today. For now though, all we need are some bits from the screws bag. First there's a body clip, a 3mm washer, an M3x8 screw and an O-ring. We'll also need a decal sheet too when we get there. Before we assemble everything, the rest of the overspray film needs to be peeled off. It's easy to miss. The first RC body I ever painted, a Kyosho Alfa Romeo, still has all its lovingly applied decals on the overspray film. It was years before I even noticed. I'd like to think everybody's done it at least once, especially when the instructions have no mention at all of the film. For the dash decal, it's easiest to start by roughly cutting it out from the sheet with a large border. Then, with it nice and manageable, go around and trim it right up to the edge. Small scissors work well, or if you're feeling brave, a steel ruler and a sharp knife can get some super clean cuts. To apply it, first we will hold it down into position to get a feel for where it's going to go, making a mental note of how close to the edges of the plastic it's going to be. Then peel back some of the backing paper and trim a centimetre or so off before sticking the decal back down. Now we can position the decal, being very careful not to stick the exposed bit until it's in the perfect spot. When it's just so, stick it down and peel off the rest of the backing while pressing the decal down. If you're a bit careful and take your time, decals go down perfectly every time. The screw hole for the steering wheel needs to be cleared, but that's just a case of running around the hole with a nice sharp knife. Okay, here's the gear stick ready to fit. I went for a pool ball theme and picked out the rods with some silver. Chances are no one's ever actually going to notice once it's fitted, but I think it's a nice detail all the same. To fit, all we do is pop it into the large hole in the gearbox tunnel at 90 degrees to where it's going to end up, flip it over and slide the O-ring over the nub, followed by the body clip through the small hole. It's a bit of a squeeze, so some pressure is required, but it does go through. And now from the top, all we do is spin the stick around so the small nub pops into the small hole. Very nice. Steering wheel next. All I've done is paint the centre silver and given the rim some gloss clear. I think it looks a little bit better than all just black. To fit, we need the screw and the washer to go in through the back of the dashboard. And with a good but fairly gentle grip on the steering wheel, screw it into the column. The most important thing is not to do it up too tight. Just enough so the steering wheel won't spin freely will do the trick. If you go too far, the polycarbonate will squash and probably crack. Step 78, the seats. Nice simple one this. We'll need 4 M3 washers and 4 M3 by 10s. The seats themselves look rather excellent, and I'm sure would sell very well on their own. They'd work on so many 1/10 scale models. To fit them, we need to hold the seat base in the seat and line it up with the holes in the interior. Screw in 2 of the screws with the washers under the heads and job's a good un. Just like with the steering wheel, the screws don't need to be done up tight. They just need to stop the seat from wobbling around. Any more might just cause damage. Now for why I masked off some of the black paint behind the dashboard. Well, it lines up with the display on the decal. The idea is at some point I might install one of these LED voltage monitors. All I'd need to do is cut and peel back the display from the decal and stick the LED behind. I'd have to wire it into the battery too, of course. Now I'm not sure I'll ever actually get round to doing it, but it's all prepared and ready to go, so you never know. Step 79, fitting the rear of the interior. All we need is a pair of M2.5 by 8s. The interior drops down over the chassis, where the 2 holes near the back edge line up with the holes on the frame. Install the screws, making sure not to over tighten them. Now I'm sure you're going to get bored of me saying it, but it really is important. We only need the screws to take up the slack and no tighter. Step 80, the bonnet, or hood if you like. We'll need 6 M2.5 by 8s, the front bit of the cage, and the bonnet. For now I'm going to leave the overspray film on until all the screws are partially fitted, just in case we skid something over the surface. The front cage bit slots in under the dash, so it leans backwards and the bonnet sits on the top. There's 4 screws along the rear edge and 2 at the front. They're a bit of a fiddle to fit as the holes in the polycarbonate parts are just a fraction of a millimetre off. We could open the holes up just a fraction, but I think if we install each screw a turn or so, we can get them all started before doing them all up just a bit at a time. Having said that, I do think drilling them out just 2.6 millimeters would probably be the best thing to do. Now we've got them all partially in, we can peel off the overspray film, giving us an ever so shiny bonnet. The parts always look so nice until they collect dust and fingerprints. The standard advice for tightening the screws applies. They just want to be tight enough to take up the slack and no more. Step 81, the first half of the cage. Right, I'm not going to do a screw by screw on this one. There's 4 types of M2.5 screws and a single very long M3. But as long as you pay attention to which one goes where, there's not really a lot that can go wrong. The main tip for the build is you can nip up the screws that attach the side to the chassis, but leave the roof and the rear bit loose so the parts can still move. It will make lining them up with the other side of the cage a lot easier. Okay, step 82, the other half of the cage. This is almost the same as the previous step, except this time we've got the rearmost parts of the cage and the mounts for the optional anti-roll bar. We've got a similar pile of M2.5 screws and the long M3. This time we've also got 4 M3 by 15s for the rear part of the cage. So, just like before, we'll start by fitting one side of the cage with all its screws. Install the screws into the roof parts, leaving them just a little bit loose. Next we'll put the rear bit in with the mounts. They can be a bit of a pain to keep lined up and get the screws to start in the hole, but with a bit of perseverance they do all go together. Nip up all the screws and we have a rather impressive looking cage. It really does look the part. Step 83, the battery door. Back to full detail now, as this one can go a bit wrong if you're not careful. There's 3 plastic parts that we need: the door itself, the knob and the locking bit. For the screws there's 2 M2.5 by 8s, one's a cap head and the other's a dome. And we'll also need an M2.5 by 10. From the outside of the door, the knob part sits in a recess. The M2.5 by 8 cap head then goes through the hole in the middle. From the back, the locking piece lines up with the screw. Then slowly tighten the screw, pulling the 2 plastic parts together. The knob should end up being able to turn fairly freely and not wobble. If it's really stiff, things might need a little bit of a fettle just to make them just so. Next, the door needs to slot into the cage and the lock locked to hold it in position. From the top we install the M2.5 by 10, making sure not to do it up all the way. It needs to be loose enough we can still open and close the door. The same goes for the M2.5 by 8 that gets installed from the bottom. If the door's a bit stiff to open, loosen the screws a bit at a time until it's nice and free. Step 84, the roof and the cooling fans. This is going to be a quick one. We've got 4 M2.5 by 8 dome heads to fit the roof and 4 M2.5 by 8 cap heads for the fans. First we need to cut the fans from the decal sheet, peel the overspray film and stick the fans on. It doesn't look too bad, but I think this would be a good candidate for some 3D printed parts. The roof goes on the top of the cage and gets its 4 screws fitted. Nice and simple. The fan panel sits on the angled bit of the cage behind the roof and gets its 4 screws fitted. The only thing worth mentioning is, again, don't do them up too tight, just take up the slack. Step 85, the rear light pod. This one needs 3 M3 by 8 countersunk screws to fit. The light pod has a nice decal with some fake lights on, which we could stick on, but I think we're going to end up replacing the pod with one with some proper working lights. So we'll just fit the pod as it is, as I think it'll add some protection until we can swap it for one with the LEDs. Step 86, the side panels. Right, this step is rather labour intensive and more than a little awkward. Basically we need to use 24 M2.5 by 8 screws to fit all these panels to the cage. When they're all on, it does look rather good. It'll look even better once all the overspray film's peeled off though. It's always a bit of a moment when you've got it all peeled off and it's oh so very shiny, but that never really lasts very long. We would be doing step 87 now, which is fitting the foams in the tyres, but they've already done it for us. So let's go straight on to step 88, the bead locks. Well, there's no escaping the fact bead locks are annoying and very repetitive to build, but they're still better than gluing the tyres. The parts for the wheels are fairly typical. They're plastic, but they do feel nice and strong. The ring goes inside the tyre, and the 2 wheel halves insert from either side. So far so typical. The nice bit is they give us some oversized screws, M2.5 by 15s, and plain nuts to pull the wheel halves together so the shorter screws in the next step will actually reach. They don't need to be fully done up tight, just most of the way there. The important bit is to do up the 2 screws a bit at a time to try and keep the 2 wheel halves level with each other. Step 89, more screws in the wheels. Now we can install M2.5 by 8s and nuts in all the remaining holes. We'll use a little bit of thread lock in the nuts this time so things can't vibrate loose. Just a little bit on a cocktail stick applied to the inside of the nuts will do the job. The nuts then fit into some hex-shaped holes on the inside of the wheel and the screw goes in from the outside. Install all the screws so they're just snug to the plastic and even with the 2 long screws, but not done up all the way. Step 90, swapping the long screws for some short ones. Yep, this time we remove the 2 long screws, thread lock the nuts, and install 2 M2.5 by 8s. This time, once they're even, we can go around using the good old cross pattern to tighten up all the screws. Top to the bottom, left to the right, and so on. Not quite the way GMade do it, but that's fine. I think the GMade method in the manual would probably work just as well. Now we just need to do that another 3 times, so we've got a full set of wheels ready to fit. Build up the wheels with a nice film on the telly is my recommendation. It does make time go so much faster. Step 90, fitting the wheels. This is absolutely typical stuff. We've got 4 drive pins, 4 wheel hexes and 4 M4 nuts. The pin goes through the end of the axle, the hex slides over the top, followed by a wheel, and finally a nut. Repeat with the other 3 wheels and we've got a rolling truck. But I'm not going to show you the whole truck yet, as there's a bit more to do. Step 91, hubcaps, and the final step of the build. First, there's the hubcaps, which have some rather nice 3D stickers to stick in the middles. You can peel them up and tack them to the end of a knife to transfer them to the caps. There's a nice recess that means they self-center. The thing to watch out for is not to touch the sticky bit with your fingers. Once all the stickers are on, we're going to need 32 M2.5 by 8s to attach the caps to the wheels. Well, if you haven't finished a movie from doing the beadlocks, now's a good time to finish it. It's always good to end a build on a high. Okay, while technically we've finished the build as far as the manual goes, there's a couple more bits to take care of. First, the power button for the ESC needs sticking down. It looks like the flat area just in front of the ESC is going to be accessible, so we'll just stick it down there. Job done. There's one more thing to do. The kit comes with an extra bag with some lights in. They look simple enough to install. If we clip the bits we need from the parts tree and lay them out, it looks a bit like this. The lens clips into the bucket. It's nice and tight, so we're not going to need any glue. On the front there's a protective grille that again just clips in place. On the back there's an LED clip that's installed with a tiny Phillips head self-tapper. Shame it's not a cap head like the rest of the kit, but it'll do. To attach them to the model, there's a pair of M3 by 8s. They go through 2 holes in the front of the cage and thread into the light pods. Nice and simple, and should look pretty good when there's some LEDs. Right, well, that's the build finished, so here's the wide shot. And well, I'm rather pleased with how it's turned out. It looks pretty mean and very shiny. I like it. Something that's worth pointing out now it's all put together. Because of how the battery goes in, quite a lot of LiPo packs that fit in the tray won't work because of where the leads come out. You really can't get them in. Packs with the bullet connectors would work if you solder the leads at 90 degrees, or I found these 4Ah flight packs fit quite well too, the leads coming out the side rather than the top. The 2S1s are a good fit, and the 3S1s go in too with a little bit of jiggling. Now I'm going to leave you with a pic and a bit of Ken Burns that shows quite nicely just how long ago I actually finished the truck. That's a very cold, frosty day back in February. It was a fun first run, but you're going to have to wait until the next GOM video to actually see it in action. In the meantime, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if you've got something to say. Bye guys!